After 30 years of public service, I have begun my conclusion of my public duties fighting for an issue that I fought for when I began my service as a member of the Montana Constitutional Convention in 1972. I am pleased to introduce Senate Bill 306, an act to abolish the death penalty in Montana and to replace it with life imprisonment without possibility of release. And as we start this debate, I want to make that clear, without possibility of release. In no way does this bill come to you to try to show some sympathy for some of the acts that some of these people have committed that are so bad. But what we are doing with this bill is moving forward, and in the next few minutes, and I know in the years that I've spent in this Montana Senate that I hope and I know that there'll be a wonderful debate that'll take place concerning this issue. Let's talk just for a moment about the actual execution of a life. Few of us will ever have to witness a sort of horrific event. But imagine, if you will, that you are there. The first thing that is called to mind is the executioner remains anonymous. That's the way it is. He remains anonymous. His identity is hidden for several reasons, and one of them is symbolic. Traditionally, the executioner wears a hood as the emblem that every adult Montanan collectively imposes the ultimate penalty on the convicted capital crimes. In other words, this person is performing the action for every Montanan when the execution takes place. Have you thought of your own hand putting these people to death? Just for a minute, just think about that. Because it is your hand and mine and every adult Montanan that communally signals the end of a human life. Do we as lawmakers have the right to demand that every Montanan perpetrate this ugly tradition? This is the gravest of all matters that can ever come before you. It is a very solemn matter of life and death. And shouldn't life be every lawmaker's default vote unless compelling and convincing arguments are presented to justify the incurring death? To vote to retain the death penalty, to vote to preserve the status quo, you must absolutely be sure, on the behalf of yourself and the constituents and every citizen of the state of Montana, that system is equitably, and fairly enforced. Whether the defendant be black or white, brown or red, whether the defendant is rich or poor, or well-connected or not. We owe the people of Montana and the legislators to provide the framework for the legal system which administers impartial and unbiased justice. And yet, only 2% of the convicted homicides are sentenced to death. Is that fair? I'm going to say that again. Only 2% of the convicted homicides are sentenced to death. Those who are poor are more likely to be convicted of a capital crime because they cannot afford quality legal representation. Is that fair? Those who kill a white victim as opposed to other race are more likely to be convicted of a capital crime. Is that fair? Scholars have shown that time and time again death penalty is not now, has never been, and can never be applied fairly. Fellow senators, you must absolutely be sure that there is no chance that an innocent person could be executed. And yet, 123 death row in America have been exonerated from a crime for which they were accused. It took those of you who exonerated the average 9 years of incarceration to prove their innocence. A 1987 study detailed 23 cases where innocent people had already been executed. The rate at which an innocence occurs means that if Montana continues to oppose the death penalty sentences, is not a question of will an innocent person be put to death or when an innocent person will be put to death. It is absolutely sure that the death penalty deters crime. Is that a purpose? And yet, a 2004 study by economist Joanna M. Shepard showed that executions have no effect by the time that a person is executed far outweighs the average person who would spend the rest of their life in prison. Every state that has ever undertaken a cost study of death penalty system has found capital cases to be substantially more expensive than cases where prosecutors seek lengthy prison sentences. And 46% of those who were convicted of Montana in lengthy and costly capital trial process since 1976 were eventually resentenced to an extended life sentence anyway. As we stand here today, fellow senators, there is no budget item in the death penalty cases. That means that when a prosecutor requests a death sentence, those heavy death penalty expenditures are extracted from other governmental budgets for sentences that are unlikely to be carried out anyway. Is this fiscally responsible? We must be absolutely sure that the best way for families of murder victims to not the certain swift sentences of life without parole, but a long, rocky road of capital sentencing and appeals. You must be absolutely sure that the best interests are at heart when convicted murderers can instead be segregated to a lonely and long life in prison, with full understanding that they have been judged unfit to enter society ever again. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, you must be absolutely sure that our belief in human life is such that we teach our children that is to prevent violence, we beget violence. That legalized murder is the answer to unlawful murder. Of all things, you must be sure, for this is the gravest matter of life and death. I'm confident that the death penalty is one of the sentences that you cannot, when all facts are on the table, retain. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I would like to thank you for your attention. I think this is one of the most important issues that we're going to face during this legislative session. And I hope, as my career as a legislator comes to an end, that you will recognize the fact that this is an issue that has been with us for a long time. This is an issue that I think has plagued many people throughout our state. And I would hope very much that you would look at this issue and feel that it's time that we as a state, we as a nation, move away from the death penalty. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.